at introducere professor David Charles fra Northumbria University. David Charles er professor i Enterprise and Innovation ved Universitetet i Northumbria. Han er uddannet som geograf og har tidligere været forskningsleder ved Lincoln International Business School. Han har også en lang karrierebase som forsker ved Center of Urban and Regional Development Studies i Newcastle, og han har også gjort en fortid i Australien. Så han kender til forskellige universitetssystemer, og det har han brugt i sin forskning. Det har sådan set været genstand for hans forskning, hvordan forskellige universiteter og universitetssystemer hænger sammen. So, Charles, the word is yours. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to come in and talk to you. It's particularly nice to get away from the UK for a couple of days and escape the collective madness, you know. But even coming here, you still hear about it. I'm not going to mention the word. What I want to do is talk about small campuses, satellite campuses, branch campuses, campuses in more rural regions. This picture here, this is a picture of Scarborough on the east coast of England. A town probably a similar size to Esbjerg, with an interesting story about a branch campus, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But these are the kind of places I'm interested in here. So, what are the challenges that we face in these small... It's difficult to know what to call it, because sometimes I talk about rural universities or rural campuses, but often they're not necessarily in rural areas, they're in small towns and cities. So it's not quite rural, but the area around typically is. But it's in non-metropolitan areas that are typically not well covered by higher education. And I think increasing political demand for universities to serve these areas, to locate campuses in these sort of places. And often these areas, the reason for that is that these areas have low levels of participation in higher education. A lot of people in these areas, they don't go to university, and the view is then they need that opportunity, therefore they need a university campus to achieve that. But then there are other expectations that often comes if a town hears it's going to get a university campus, they think, wow, you know, we will be transformed, we will become much more vibrant and multicultural, and you know, we'll have all these students around. It'll transform the city and make it much more economically dynamic. And it doesn't always happen quite like that. So universities have got these sort of pressures on them, but they're also working in very complex networks and alliances. They're subject to all kinds of financial pressures and issues. And they're struggling. On the one hand, they have expectations that they will work with local partners, both on the main campus and on the branch campuses. But they're also heavily involved in international collaborations, in some cases international campuses. My own university has a new campus in Amsterdam, for obvious reasons perhaps, but also has very strong presence in Asia. We're one of the biggest UK providers of higher education in Hong Kong. So, you know, we're international, but also expected to do things at a local level. So, you know, following on from the earlier talk, what can we learn about different approaches in different places? All universities are different, all countries have different systems. What can we learn from them? So I'm going to talk about three themes or three parts to the talk. First of all, say a little bit about the regional engagement agenda, although a lot of that follows on from the earlier conversations, so I'll skip over that fairly quickly. Talk about experiences of satellite campuses in the UK and in Australia, probably Australia first and then the UK. and then say a little at the end about sort of options and opportunities. I might say a little bit about Lincoln, which is quite an interesting experience. So this sort of stuff I'm just going to go through fairly quickly. There are lots of challenges that universities face and expectations as to what they will deliver for their local regions. Regardless of the university or the type of university, there are still expectations that they will have a benefit to the local community. They attract talent, they supply knowledge, they help to shape the quality of place. Having a concentration of students in a place makes a difference. The kind of activities those students and the academic staff get up to in a town makes a difference. They contribute to the cultural life of the place. The physical campus can have quite a dramatic effect. Just recently, I had a meeting in our business school, and someone from the city council had walked through the campus to get to our school, which is on the far side of the campus, to the city council offices. And he commented on the quality of the physical environment walking through the campus, that we made a nice campus to attract students. We don't do this just for the public good. We do it because we want to attract students. But he was commenting on the quality of place that the university creates. And there's a wide variety of challenges, though, that we face, some of which helps us to engage with the community, some of which makes it more difficult. Some of the challenges of mass higher education. In the UK, we're currently just short of 50% of the population goes into university. And that brings all kinds of challenges and issues. And particularly because of the fees issue, that students feel themselves to be consumers and make certain demands and so on. So we're working with a complex environment. We have quite a diversity of missions. As Alan was saying, the UK has quite a diverse set of universities. We're not all the same. We occupy very different positions within the higher education system. And that then has implications for what the universities can offer to their regions. I just make that point about knowledge, that we in providing knowledge to the region, we can do that in different ways. Knowledge could be seen as a commodity. We can commercialize university intellectual property. Knowledge in terms of human capital, the main contribution we make, we train students who go out into the community with that knowledge. Main sort of knowledge exchange process we do, but also knowledge as social capital because of the way we connect things together. So it's a big challenge to meet this agenda, and a big challenge also to work out what we do, to measure what we do, to assess what we do. All the different kinds of links and relationships that a university has with its region. Typically, politicians tend to focus on the interactions with business and the exchange of knowledge and technology to businesses, but that's only a small part of what universities get up to. Lots of other relationships, staff engaged with all kinds of things, both professionally and socially. Voluntary activities on the part of students, big issue in the UK. I don't know how it works here. And increasingly in the UK, universities are thinking themselves as anchor institutions within their communities, big employers within their cities and regions that because of their size, because of the kind of institutions they are, they carry some responsibility for the stewardship of the places in which they're based. And part of this idea of the engaged university, that universities actually carry a certain amount of burden for the places in which they're based. And that is a burden in a sense which is taken on willingly. It's something which we ought to be doing. We have an obligation to do these things, and it's something which fits with other parts of the academic mission. So, we hear in the UK lots of vice-chancellors that sort of go by. We are an anchor institution. We are really important to the region we're in. And they get involved in all kinds of local governance structures. So sitting on boards for economic development within their local region, all that sort of thing. So universities see themselves very much as central to their regions. And as academics, when we try to analyze this, there are lots of different frameworks we use to sort of explain the nature of the engaged university. And I've got a slide on each of these, and I'm not going to go through them. I'll just quickly mention some of them. But on the one hand, we talk about the entrepreneurial university, the university which goes out there, creates businesses, acts entrepreneurially in terms of its own right, sets up satellite campuses overseas to earn money and so on, behaves in an entrepreneurial way. We have the idea of the triple helix. I don't know if people are familiar with the triple helix, where you've got university, business, and government increasingly working together, and the idea is that they're sort of entwined in a kind of helix formation as they each interact and work collaboratively within local environments. Regional innovation systems, very much central to European policy for regional development, and modified through the idea of smart specialization strategies. That innovation occurs within systemic formations, in some cases at a regional level. Some cases the regional level doesn't work very effectively, so you can't necessarily call it a system, but in successful regions there is this systemic quality for the way in which firms and institutions and universities and government all work together to promote and support an innovative environment. And the university is central to that kind of debate. Now in that, perhaps the university has a slightly wider remit than the idea of the entrepreneurial university. It's not just about spin-offs of technology-based firms. The university as a center of a regional innovation system has a perhaps wider role. It's not just about the technology, it's about the skills, and it's about all kinds of other things that they might be doing. We've already heard about the idea of new production of knowledge, that increasingly to solve the problems that we're facing, we have to work collaboratively across disciplines and across sectors, universities working with other partners because they can't do it on their own. And then finally, a more kind of holistic view of the engaged university, which sort of wraps all these other things up together in a sense and says a university has a responsibility to be an adaptive institution that responds to its region, that works in all kinds of different ways. It's not just about technology, it could be about providing language training to local businesses that want to export to China or whatever it is, social, cultural. It's about looking after the health of the local environment. So we've got all these different frameworks that apply to different universities, and vice-chancellors are thinking about how to use these sort of things in their strategy and how to position themselves within their regions. So this has now become quite a central issue within university strategy development. Now, as I say, I'll just flip through these slides. And we have to think, though, also, there's the university central strategy, but also about individuals. Because we can identify there's a kind of scholarship and engagement for individual academics. So alongside our scholarship of teaching and scholarship of research, we have a scholarship of engagement. It's not just something that you do on the side, which is easy to do. Effective engagement has its own set of skills that need to be learnt as to how to do this effectively. And individual academics, they work within their community of practice within the university, sharing approaches and knowledge and language with their immediate colleagues, but also inserting themselves into communities of practice outside the university with partners and building a shared process of knowledge development outside the university also. So we're looking at engagement from a top-down view within the university, but also individuals and how they choose to work outside the university. So, that was the first part. The second part then is, okay, well, what about these non-metropolitan campuses? How does this work once we start moving out into rural universities? And in a sense, much of the literature, much of the kind of policy making focuses on the main campus of the big universities in cities. Much of the stuff that you read about universities talks about these main campuses. But there is this policy issue of what happens in the white areas on the map, and how do we put provision into these places. So there's a growth of branch campuses, but certainly from where I come from the UK, and also from Australia, where I used to work, there's quite a mixed experience. There's lots of tensions, lots of difficulties and problems. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So what benefits are there, but what are the challenges? And it's interesting, this arrived in my email box this morning. It's a topical issue. So this is a map showing access to university main campuses in Europe. And obviously you can see, as you move further to the periphery of Europe, you tend to find there's lower shares of population. But in the little background paper to this, it comments that, of course, we only have mapping data for main campuses, not for satellite campuses. So this map doesn't take into account the existence of satellite campuses. But they recognize that this is a problem, that these campuses are a solution to the problem, but are not being captured in the kind of data that they've got. So anyway, rural campuses, under what conditions do we get them? Well, often there's some sort of demand from the locality to have a university presence. Most of the cases I can think of, the town, the city, the region has lobbied hard to get a university. In Australia, there's a certain amount of political pork barrel type lobbying that goes on to get hold of a university campus. The university that sponsors that campus has to have some sort of interest in doing this. Universities won't do these sort of things unless they want to do them. And there has to be some kind of national policy that supports this, that, for example, allows a university to get quota for students for a new campus that's set up. Branch campus is typically the way in which the needs of rural areas are dealt with. Very few new complete universities put into smaller towns and rural areas. Certainly in the UK, very few examples, but there are lots of branch campuses. And when we talk about Australia, I mean, I started thinking about this when I was working in Australia. I'd done a little bit of work on rural campuses before I went to Australia, but I started thinking a bit more about it then. And there are lots of different kinds of universities with outreach branch campuses. Some of the metropolitan universities, both the old research-based universities and the newer technological universities, have rural campuses. There are specialist rural universities, Sunshine Coast, James Cook, which is up in the north of Queensland. Specialised network universities. Central Queensland University, CQU, is quite an interesting case. The Vice-Chancellor just before this session asked me if there are other universities I knew that have 6 campuses. Central Queensland University has probably about 6 main campuses because they don't really have a central campus. What they have is several campuses across the towns in the central part of Queensland, plus a few sort of small offshoots. And then a lot of these universities that are based out in more rural areas also have a campus in the city to attract international students, because they need the money from the international students, and then international students won't go and study in a small town in the middle of nowhere. So they need to have a metropolitan campus as well. Just to give some examples, this is the black dots show you the campuses of 6 universities. These are 6 universities which have a lot of small campuses. So the white dots are the sort of central point, but these black stars, I think they are, show all of the other campuses that they have, quite dispersed. So this is the kind of phenomenon that we're looking at. And they're relatively small campuses. This one is in Cairns, branch of James Cook University. This one is in a place called Hervey Bay, which is near Fraser Island. It was originally a campus of University of Southern Queensland and was handed over to University of the Sunshine Coast. This one in Ipswich, which is not too far from Brisbane, was originally University of Queensland and was taken over by the University of Southern Queensland, having lost this one. And then this one's in northern Tasmania. Just examples, they're relatively small campuses, you know the kind of thing. Typically 1,000, perhaps 2,000 students maximum. And they're enthusiastic in terms of engagement. They have a lot of support from the local community. I've been and interviewed people around these sites, and the community is very keen to have them. They want to keep their young people in the area, and they think a university is important to do that. So retaining local students is important. A lot of the students in these areas are relatively low socioeconomic status, typically don't go to university, so it's about reaching out to these types of students. And they tend to deliver fairly standardized, high-volume type programs. They're not very specialized in sort of discipline terms. But there are a lot of questions over their sustainability. Some of the universities have tried to extract themselves from these campuses because they cost a lot to run. They're not very efficient. There's certain services need to be provided, but there aren't the economies of scale. And some of the universities have pulled out. I worked at Curtin University, and we had an agricultural campus called Moresque, which was in a small village, really, called Northam. Tiny place, very small campus. A lot of affection from the local farming community, because a lot of them did their training there. But their kids didn't want to go there. Their kids wanted to be in the city. And this place needed a lot of investment. It was losing money. And so the university took the decision they had to pull out. Huge political outcry. Eventually the campus was turned over to another kind of research institute with some vocational training sort of thing, but the university pulled its degree program out into the city. So this is agricultural training. They had to pull it out into the city because that's where the students wanted to be. Lilydale, another example, was a campus just on the edge of Melbourne, just outside of Melbourne. And Swinburne University decided they needed to close it because it wasn't viable, and they wanted to move the students into the city campuses. The parents of the students, the local community, were outraged. Students thought it was fantastic. The only reason they were in Lilydale was because their grades weren't good enough to get into the city campus. So this was a means of getting into the city campus, having not qualified to do so. So, you know, these things are quite complex and politically fraught. Some of the more research-intensive universities, like University of Queensland, Monash, had rural campuses, which they then handed over to another university that's better at running regional campuses, who understands the needs better, because those campuses weren't delivering for the core mission of a research-intensive university. who were more interested in their international campuses in South Africa, or I mean, Monash have one in Prato in Italy, for example. You know, they were much more interested in that than in some campus down the road in the mining area in the eastern edge of Victoria. So what about the UK? There's been problems in Australia. What about the UK? Traditionally, universities in the UK were very much city-based. And then when we got the polytechnics and a new round of universities, there were some in smaller towns, smaller cities, but a lot of the polytechnics, for example, went into the big towns and cities. So there was a small number, and one or two that you might have heard about, obviously places like Cambridge and St Andrews that are in small towns, but most of them are in very big places. But since 2000, there's been a greater development. You know, we had a university in Cumbria, we had a university in Cornwall, we have Highlands and Islands in Scotland. So there's been a move towards more rural provision and more of these satellite campuses. So I did a study 3 or 4 years ago now, where I was looking at these 6 case studies. Lincoln is a bit exceptional on that list, and this was actually just before I moved to Lincoln. But they're quite an interesting set of campuses. And something has gone slightly wrong with this map, but never mind. So what you've got is University of the Highlands and Islands, very curious institution. It's a network of 13 colleges, each of which has a little bit of university provision that they connect together. So they're working from 13 sites across north of Scotland and the islands. And then they have outreach centres as well. So these are villages, you know, these are tiny places. In the borders, there's Galashiels, which was an independent college, now part of Heriot-Watt University. Dumfries and Galloway, where Glasgow and west of Scotland both have a campus. Cumbria, which is a new university, which is brought together of several small bits of universities. In Yorkshire, there was Scarborough, which was part of Hull University. And then in Lincolnshire, you've got University of Lincoln, which has a small satellite down in the south of the county as well. This is University of Highlands and Islands. As you see, this is very rural. Out in the islands and Skye, the one in Skye is actually Gaelic speaking. So there's added problems of another language. But they're sort of dotted about. One's up in Scotland and Orkney and Shetland. So these are kind of interesting places. So what's going on there? Going out and talking to them, talking to their partners, they are engaged campuses. They are working very closely with their local community. Their reason for existence is to work closely with their local community. So they have a broad base of engagement where there are examples of scholarship of engagement where individuals are going out working with local community organizations, working with local firms and so on. So lots of stuff going on, very positive. But there are some problems. And one of the problems comes from their smallness. The fact that they are small, they have to specialize. And they have to make choices. And the typical choice is, do you focus on meeting the educational needs of the community, of targeting those kids who would not otherwise go to university? So you're trying to bring people into the university system who wouldn't typically, and so you're offering easy pathways into higher education. So you're offering quite generic subjects. And in some cases, what they're doing is they're bringing in the teaching staff from another campus elsewhere to deliver a broad base of education on that site. Problem with that is, for a lot of the local businesses, that's a relatively superficial offer. It's very generic. It's not specialized to their needs. And there's quite a diverse set of local businesses. You know, these are rural areas, but it doesn't mean to say it's agriculture. Some of these areas are more manufacturing intensive than the big cities. And they're often quite specialist. And these generic approaches don't necessarily deliver their needs. They don't have the kind of engineering and high-cost activities that they might be interested in. So there's some tensions around that. The alternative, that some of them focus on a very specific discipline which is applicable to that rural area and become very focused. In Galashiels, the college there, it was originally a college of textiles that emerged from the fact that it was a local textiles, woolen textiles producing area. So it has a specialization around textiles. And it is now the Faculty of Textiles for Heriot-Watt University. Some of the Highlands and Islands sites are very specialized. So you have stuff relating to the oil industry up in Shetland, for example. So some of them are specialized around technologies and local industry. And they deliver extremely well for that local industry. And they support that local industry. And it may not be a technology industry, it may be sort of outdoor leisure or something like that. But they deliver for them. But there's a lot of the local student demand isn't satisfied by that because they don't want to do that. They want to do something different. And if they specialize in that particular area, then they can't specialize in all kinds of other areas. So there are choices to be made. And interestingly, talking to some of the ones that are more specialized, they say, well, actually, a lot of our students come from outside the region. So they're bringing in new people into the region, which is a positive thing, but they're not necessarily delivering in terms of local educational needs. Dumfries is really interesting because you have two universities on a shared campus. One of them, Glasgow, delivers some very specific things around primary education in rural areas and health in rural areas. And all their students come from outside, so they have to provide student accommodation for them. Their students come from outside the region, and they work with local employers. University of the West of Scotland has a campus, and they deliver very generic education around sort of business studies and stuff like that. And all of their students come locally, and they have no accommodation for students. And their students all work in local jobs, but the university really struggles to work with local employers because they don't have anything very specialist to offer. So there's real tensions which we see playing out in these campuses. So yeah, this is the one in Dumfries. It was formerly a mental hospital which closed down, and they had to decide what to do with it. Actually, the one earlier in Australia, in Ipswich, that was also a mental hospital that had closed down, and they had to find something to do with it. The funny thing about Dumfries, though, was back in the 1830s, there was a guy called Crichton, and this is called the Crichton campus, left some money to create a university in Dumfries. And at the time, they tried to persuade St Andrews to relocate to Dumfries because they were having some problems with their local community. And they tried to bribe them to come across to Dumfries, and they failed to do that. The other universities in Scotland blocked the idea of a new university. So they said, oh, well, we can't attract a university, let's create a mental hospital instead. And then a century or more later, they turned the site into a university campus, after all. So this one is the one in Galashiels, and the university wanted to close it, and there was a huge outcry from the local community. So they decided to reinvest, and they built a new building. But the building is actually shared with a vocational college as well. So the two institutions working side by side within the same building. The two buildings are physically connected. Yeah, so this is where we get into questions of smart specialization, that, where do universities fit in these rural areas in terms of contributing to the emergence of particular areas of specialization and working with local businesses. If they go down that smart specialization route, it does limit the breadth of what they can do within the region. And some universities would ask this question: why would a university center a core discipline in a rural campus? And that's a challenge. Why would you put it over there rather than having it on the main campus? If it's agriculture or something that needs to be there, then fine. But if it's something else, why would you put it somewhere where there's less control? But some of them do. But some of them do. Community expectation is interesting because there was a sense that they didn't feel they'd got what they expected from the campus. They thought they were going to get a university, and what they got was a small campus. And it's not the same. It's much better than what they had before. They're grateful for it. They will fight to keep it. But it's not perhaps quite what they expected. It doesn't deliver everything they wanted. And that's a problem of scale. I remember in Cumbria, in Carlisle, someone from the local agency said, when we heard we were getting a university, we thought, great, it'll be like Newcastle. There'll be all this kind of cultural life and so on. And no, it wasn't like Newcastle. And so the local development agencies were working very supportively with their campus. They tried to bring in European funding to help develop programs for local entrepreneurs and all this sort of thing. But they recognized that they still had to turn to universities elsewhere at the same time because the local campus couldn't deliver everything that they had. And to some degree, that's something they just had to live with. They had to work around that. So this is, and there's quite a lot of activity to support entrepreneurship. Long-term viability, several of the universities had at some point tried to close down their campus. There were stresses. In Scotland, Glasgow tried to pull out of Dumfries and were bribed by the Scottish government. In other places, the community lobbied to keep the campus going, and the university eventually decided to change their views. So, a lot of attempts to keep this. And partly it relates to the way the university organizes. I think the next, yeah. In some cases, we've got a campus which is, it fits into the university structure. So there's a center, you've got a set of faculties, and you've got the university campus as a faculty or school which has an autonomous structure and has a seat in the university organization, and they can lobby effectively for resources and defend their issues. What we have in some cases is this, where the campus has bits of schools that are headquartered elsewhere in the university. And there may be a campus manager that helps to sort of integrate that locally. But ultimately, these people answer to this school, and these people answer to that school. And what happened in Hull, where there was a campus in Scarborough, town similar size to Esbjerg, campus with a couple of thousand students. And what happened was there were several of these schools involved, and each of them started making decisions to pull things out of Scarborough independently, without any kind of strategic oversight from the university. And in the end, the university said, hang on, something's going on here. We're reducing students on this campus. And they had to review the whole thing, and they decided they would pull out. So this is the campus. It's quite nice old, it was a college which was taken over by the university because the university wanted to have a campus in the area. It's quite a nice place to be, nice town. There's some big local employers that are very interested in working with the university and so So a good environment, but Hull University was never particularly interested. So they decided to pull out, and they decided to sell the campus to a college that would still provide some higher education, but also some below degree level vocational stuff. However, Hull College also decided to pull out. And in the end, you had students demanding a refund of fees because the campus was described as a ghost town. And Grimsby Institute, another college, actually further away on the other side of the Humber, decided to take over the campus as a college. But just as that closed as a university campus, Coventry University from the Midlands, no connection, other side of the country, decided, we'll set up a new campus there. New greenfield campus, other side of town, no connection to the old one, apart from they hired the campus manager to come across and work on the new campus. And they've set up a new campus because they saw there was an opportunity there. Coventry is quite entrepreneurial. They saw that there was a demand for higher education in the town. The local community was very supportive of the idea of having a university. So there was obviously a demand, and Coventry reckoned they had a better model that can deliver. Coventry have also got a campus in London, and they've got campuses elsewhere, and they've got a college. They're very entrepreneurial in building these sort of things. And they thought they could make it work. So they've created a new campus. As you see, it's very new. We don't know how that works out yet. So lots of interesting experiences and approaches. On the one end, you've got Highlands and Islands, which is this very bizarre structure of 13 independent colleges which form an alliance to deliver university education across multiple sites in a very sparsely populated area. Lots of blended learning, combination of common curriculum for some things, but also little specialization. So if you want to do Gallic literature, you go to Skye. If you want to do oil engineering, petroleum engineering, you go to Shetland. So there's lots of interesting things. Nuclear engineering, you go to Thurso, because it's not far from Dounreay, which was an experimental fast breeder reactor, which they're currently trying to dismantle. So there's some interesting areas of engineering specialization around that. Lots of different kinds of experiences in other places, though. Different models. So, in the US, we've got the idea of a state system with multiple campuses, some of which are small community colleges in rural areas, some of which are the big research-intensive university in the core city. We've got urban and metropolitan universities with rural outposts. Multi-campus universities, genuine multi-campus universities like Central Queensland, which have, quite broad teaching on multiple sites. New universities in more rural regions. I'll talk about Lincoln in a moment. I've got 5 minutes? Yeah. And then in Finland, I don't know if you're aware of these multi-institutional university centres, places like Seinäjoki and Pori, where you've got a small campus where 3, 4, 5 universities each place some staff to work collectively with local partners. Very research-driven, addressing local sort of technology needs and so on, working with local industry. But these are quite small, but they're multi-institutional, and they work in a single sort of facility. So there's lots of different models out there, but all of them, trying to deal with the kind of tensions and conflicts that I've been talking about. You've got to specialize, but how do you specialize? How do you meet the diverse needs? There's often a view that when you're outside in more rural areas, like some of these are, that your local needs are predominantly about agriculture, but they're not, because these places are quite diverse. A place like Moray in the north of Scotland, you think this is a big agricultural area, and the main industry is fabrication for the North Sea oil fields. And you know, it's big, heavy engineering they do there. So Lincoln, where I'm still a visiting professor there. I still have some PhD students there. It's a really interesting case because this was a university that was attracted to a small city which felt it ought to have a university, just over 100,000 people, middle of a big agricultural county. Didn't have a university, wanted one, so they tried to attract one. Long story, but in the end, they persuaded the University of Humberside to set up a campus there. The funny thing there was when they agreed to it, the local council were building an initial building for them. They were so desperate to attract a university. When Humberside were having some problems with their colleagues in Hull, there's a thing about Hull, but Humberside, the Vice Chancellor at Humberside said, yes, we'll put a campus in Lincoln. We're very happy to work with you on this. By the way, I'll put my office there. That's interesting. And over time, Hull moved their whole campus to Lincoln. So rather than being the second university in a city that was seen as being a bit at the end of the line and not doing very well, they became the main university in a small, quite pretty city, which was good to attract students. So the whole university moved into this new campus. There were some local colleges that had been acquired by De Montfort University from Leicester, which at one time had this idea of having lots of rural campuses. And they took over lots of places and decided, no, we're not going to do that. So they got rid of them all again. And Lincoln acquired 2 of those from De Montfort and developed the university. Quite entrepreneurially, very engaged, very much driven by the needs of the local community. They've just created a new medical school. They developed an engineering school by working collaboratively with Siemens, who are the biggest local employer. So Siemens do their training on the campus in the same building as the graduate engineers. And the engineers that are trained at Lincoln are supervised by people from the company, and they do placements in the company and so on. So lots of interesting things there. This was the site in the middle of the city. Originally it was all railway yards and so on. Now it's very different. This is the university student accommodation. This is going to be the science park. So, and right in the centre of the city, very, very heavily engaged. But they have their own branch campus now in the south of the county, which is very specialised around food production and working with food firms and with food processing firms down there. So, a few conclusions. I know Billy was getting nervous there, I was going to run on. These rural campuses are very politically popular. A very topical issue, how do we reach out? If we're looking at 50% participation, how do we ensure that that's a 50% across the country as a whole, not just dominated by the urban areas? But there are these challenges and problems. The most successful case we have in the UK probably is Lincoln. But this is where a full-range university was established. In other places it's been more difficult, there's been a lot of tensions. But a balance needs to be struck between the needs of the university and the needs of the region. And it's what we see in Australia as well, where some of the universities decide that their interests are not served by the campus, so they pull out. Whereas other universities say, this is what we do. We manage these kinds of campuses. We're a specialist in doing this effectively. So providing higher education in rural areas is always going to be a challenge. There's always going to be difficulties. There's always going to be sets of compromises. And we'll always tend to undershoot on some of the local wants and expectations. But the key thing is the university has to be committed to making it work, and has to think creatively about how it can work effectively in these areas and how it can get the benefit out of this. And it's about balancing its own interest, which might be around research performance and so on, with the interests of the community and the striking that effective balance. It's not easy. It's a challenge. But universities are full of clever people to try and make it work. Okay, thank you very much.